see there's some questions are coming through around some of the more trickier parts of things like communicating uncertainty in this context. And you both talked about uncertainty and the importance of communicating uncertainty. And that does seem to be where a lot of things trip up. When it comes to what researchers mean by uncertainty and what the rest of the world means by that. Could we see some improvements there? I mean, Richard, that is something you emphasised.
Yeah, the issue of uncertainty. I mean, it is difficult, this, especially in the clinical setting. I originally trained as a medical doctor, and when you're standing over a patient, the last thing the patient wants you to do is to have a soliloquy philosophizing about the uncertainty over what treatment I should give you or not. What the patient wants is you to make a decisive action that's going to benefit their outcome. And so clinical medicine is very much about decisions being made to protect and advance the health of the patients you serve. Mm-hmm. Science is something a little different, because what you don't want to do is to overemphasize your certainty of a particular outcome. So the two are in some ways a little bit in opposition. And certainly for a clinical journal, a medical journal like The Lancet, too often, and maybe this is the clinical training seeping into the writing, too often we see authors being a little too overconfident about what they are recommending. Right. They get a statistically significant result in a clinical trial, and they make a recommendation that this particular treatment should be made widely available. Well, there are so many caveats around the interpretation of that study, from whether it's right to extrapolate, for example, from the population participating in the study to everybody in the world. And we know so many occasions that there are geographic differences in the application of evidence to certain populations. So this is why I say humility is so important. Let's be very, very careful about our generalizing the results of our research universally.
I think we're going to come back to that theme of uncertainty throughout this series of webinars, and actually we'll try and answer a few more questions on that today, but will be some resources available as well as the slides from today on Researcher Academy for anyone who wants to delve in a bit more. There are lots and lots of questions coming through. Some of them are absolutely fascinating. Ali, did you want to have a 30-second reflection on our speakers before we jump into these questions?
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, everyone. I think this has been great, and the things that keep coming back to my mind as an early career researcher is, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the pressure that we face sometimes to produce quick results, very innovative results, and to communicate these results with a lot of excitement and hype sometimes. And I think we might if we don't really think about it, if we don't reflect about this, we might fall into the trap of maybe exaggerating our results. Also because we're excited about them. I think a lot of the times we don't do it with bad intentions. But I think after hearing this, and after receiving some of these guidelines, I think it is important that every time we get an interview, every time we get an opportunity to share results with the general public, with policymakers, etc., that we keep in mind some of the things that we've learned. And I wanted to highlight a few things that I really liked and that I'm gonna keep using in my science, and is sharing first what's the general evidence about the topic that we are researching. So it's not just about our research, it's about the dialogue that we're having with the other researchers. what's available out there. I think that's really important. What's the added value that we as researchers are providing, right? In relation to that other evidence that's there, right? It's very uncommon for our research to be the first one that's been focusing on the topic that we're researching, right? There's more evidence, and we need to keep having that dialogue with the rest of the evidence. And I think, communicating how we interpret the findings of our own research in relationship to that evidence, that I think is really important. And being humble, being honest, transparent about what our research results mean and what they don't mean. I think that's really important. Sometimes we are worried, and we are trained to be really focused on our own careers, how much advancements we're making in science, and I think that is important. But I think when we're communicating science, it's really important to be humble and to really be open about, okay, what is it that our research is really focusing on, providing to the evidence, and what is it that it is not. And I think that is really,
Right.
really important. And I think that overall, this really helps not only our own careers, but also it really helps to keep the integrity of science and to really maintain and promote that trust from the public in us as scientists.
Fantastic. Great. That's what struck me too from those presentations. I think that question of volume is, and understanding that broader context into which you put your research is very important, those two things. On that theme, we've had a question from Greer, who asks about reaching policymakers, presumably looking at this whole sea of information. As a researcher, how do you reach a policymaker? Qurecha, is that what even researchers should be trying to do? How do they? I mean, I'm imagining the policymaker being inundated with all of this promotion of all the many papers that Richard says we have in surplus. But how do you reach policymakers? Can we emphasize anything there for people thinking about that question?
Yeah, I would say two things, Tracy. The one is that, the type of research, and as I mentioned at the outset, not all of our research is going to impact policy. But I think what's important is to build relationships and partnerships on an ongoing basis, not just when you have results. Right. And I find, being based in South Africa, that, at a local level, at a provincial level, and also at a national level, it's become something one does, which is start that conversation, start those meetings, maximize opportunities so that what you're doing is known. And I guess in my case, working in infectious diseases, it's a little bit easier. But I do think, so one, it's about building relationships on an ongoing basis, not just when you have something to say. And I think when you publish your findings, depending on how pivotal and important they are, does get media coverage, and that also brings attention. But you want to use this opportunity to make a second point, which is that the knowledge generation is really a very slow process with many failures. And I think there is another pressure, which is where journals only mostly publish positive results, is that failure is also important. And I think those failures also have important lessons. And how do we balance that so that some of those failures and some of the extremes that we find is, as scientists, we debate these things. How do we make that debate process a little bit more public and open so that people get familiar with how you take knowledge, how do you turn it over in different ways, and how do you learn and move forward from that, both in terms of what we know works and don't work. Thank you.
Fantastic, because that's about getting us as a society to understand better how research actually works. And your first point was about actually researchers thinking about how policy works. And we had a point from I think it was Tala or somebody posted earlier on in the discussion online, asking about localized decision making, and we will come back to some of this. But I think understanding how the questions that you're researching appear in your local policy setting is about researchers understanding policy as much as policymakers understand research. That was, I thought, a very valuable question. Ali, I'll come back to you on some of that in the end. I want to do a few quick fire questions because there are a lot of factual things coming in. For example, Zuri asks, how far can we use AI? And Coulson asks, how is AI being used to evaluate the quality of research? Richard, do you have very brief answers to those?
Well, we're not, thank you. We're not using AI to evaluate the quality of research, at least at the moment. But what we are seeing is that artificial intelligence tools are being used to submit clearly falsified, fabricated articles. And this is a great source of concern. And this is the double-headed future of AI. Yes, AI has tremendous possibilities in science, but it also is opening the door to maybe an epidemic of falsification and fabrication, which is deeply disturbing and very, very hard for editors to weed those falsified papers out of submissions. So I'm an optimistic person by nature, and I try to retain my optimism about AI. But I do have a concern about the shadow that it might cast over science communication.
Absolutely. While I've got you on the spike, we also had a question from Shadrick about how does being really honest about all the detail sit with putting a patent on your work?
Putting a patent on your work. Well, we have had a few conflicts in the past with authors who don't want to disclose certain information about their brilliant innovation because they've got a patent on it. And I'm afraid in that case, they've crossed the line from being a scientist to being an entrepreneur. And we need both. We need entrepreneurs and we need scientists, but the two don't always go perfectly together. The scientist has to decide who he or she wants to be. Goldstein and Brown once, who you will recall, won the Nobel Prize for their work on cholesterol metabolism in the 1980s. They once said that there were 4 characteristics of being a successful scientist in medicine, and one of those was poverty. If you're going to be a great scientist, don't expect to get rich. If you want to get rich, don't be a great scientist.
Thank you. We've had some questions coming in on uncertainty as well. We're jumping around lots of different themes here. Temi asked, we have to keep our answers brief so we can fit everything in. Temi asks about, apart from the challenge in communicating the results of the scientific research, there's also the expectation of decision makers. And that's what both of you have actually talked about there. But that pull of wanting to be more certain. And earlier on, Koresha, you talked about a failure to correct. So when the results were misinterpreted, were overinterpreted, that failure to correct. So tell us a bit more about, as a researcher, if your research is taken in that way, you see that as very much still the researcher's responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have discomfort as scientists generally with speaking with policymakers, but also interacting with media. And I think, we all need to understand that science as a public good, we all doing something to enhance each other's lives. And it's not just about sensationalism. And so it's incumbent upon us, and I would say this to Tracy very quickly, is we have to build relationships with journalists, and we have to build relationships with policymakers. Those all take time. It's not when you have a game-changing result that you do that. And quite often, media personnel are looking for scientists to verify something or to check. And I do this a lot, which is fact-checking for journalists. And I've learned to work with journalists from that fact-checking on other stories that they're doing, etc. It's also part of how you do this. And so when there's something incorrect published, I am able to go up to that journalist who wrote that report, and then there are guidelines for how you report. And so retractions, as we have retractions in peer-reviewed journals, you can also do that. And I think it's important to do this, including communicating with the public. That particular story, I do very community-based research, and members from the community who I've developed a long-standing relationship come back and say, oh, so how come you didn't tell us? It's true, scientists are withholding information because they want to advance their research. All the stories that are building up, and you have to take pride in the fact that people come to you to verify something, and that you have to correct it and say, this is the situation. Then you go back to the scientists and say, you got to do this. It's compromising other research and the way, and so I can go on and on. But it's possible, as we have retractions in peer-reviewed, to do that very proactively, to make sure you're talking to policymakers, everybody, all stakeholders in a way, so that everyone is getting the right narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. We had really good questions from Preet about addressing contentious issues, and from Chinanye about differentiating propaganda from research reports. I think these are questions that we will pick up in future parts of the webinar, but very briefly, Richard, I want to leave Ale some time to respond to a couple of questions. Very briefly from you, you talked about putting the context first. Could researchers do more, perhaps, to think about those more contentious issues that might lead to their research results being misinterpreted? Could we see a bit more thinking about that, do you think, from our research base?
Yes, the context is important, but it's, I mean, we've gone through the pandemic, and there are a lot of lessons to learn from that. Mm-hmm. And by and large, I thought scientists did an absolutely fantastic job of going into the public domain, the public sphere, which they're not trained to do, and trying to explain the science almost on actually not almost, it was on a daily basis during 2020 and 2021, and trying to give the context of what was taking place, and bringing the public with them and with the evidence, and showing that the evidence was changing day by day, week by week, month by month, as we accumulated more experience. And yes, there was a backlash at times, but that was a phenomenally positive experience, I think.
Great, good. I think that's true, absolutely, and I think there's so much still for us to draw from that experience across the research communication discussion. Ale, I'll give you a couple of minutes here at the end. There are a few questions I know that were very much in your space.
Thank you, Tracy and everyone. I saw a few questions about communicating results in a localized manner, and also avoiding colonial ways of communicating science and results. And what I wanted to mention is that this is very close to what we do with our team in Guatemala, as we're doing a lot of research collaborating with Maya indigenous communities. And so what I wanted to mention is that, well, it is really important to think about how to communicate science in ways that are not colonial. I think this is something that really starts from the beginning, and it really starts from the study design phase, and the way that you partner with communities, the way that you conduct your research, and the way that you then, interpret results and communicate science. So I think this idea of communicating results in non-colonial ways or decolonial ways is really important, but I think we really need to start to think about how do we conduct research that is not colonial? And I think that if we start to really partner with community members in a way that is mutually beneficial to both scientists and the communities from the start, then we can continue to conduct research in that way. And so that when we have some of the results, even if they are preliminary, we can start having these dialogues and these conversations with community members where we're very transparent about what's been going on, what has worked well, what hasn't worked well, what are the results that we have, what are some of the things that are still missing that we need to keep working on. And I think it's really important to start to get feedback from the communities very early on, so that when we have some of the final results from our project, I am saying quoted because I don't think we ever have final results, but when we have results at the end of our project, then we can continue to communicate in the ways that communities communicate. And so often,
fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a fantastic point, I think, for us to end on, and it really does underline the importance of the relationships, of putting research into the context of the discussions going on, the needs that communities have, including the policy world, and thinking about what your research brings to that bigger picture. I think that's been a really key message that's come across from all of you. Thank you very much indeed for your questions out there in the audience, and thank you very much to Koresha, to Richard, and to Ale for your contribution and your wisdom today. Please do visit Researcher Academy for the slides, the download of this event for you to share, and also for the further information about the next two sessions when we'll be looking at what happens when things do go wrong and how to put them right. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
thank you, everyone.